Welcome to Soli
and Gauta.
Uncut. Greetings. Welcome again to another session of Soli and Gauta Uncut. Today, we're going to be talking about the role of independent media in South Africa in this big fight, ongoing fight against corruption and abuse of power. And we're really delighted tonight to be joined by Gareth Cliff, the founder of cliffcentral.com. And we have also with us an award-winning journalist at Daily Maverick, and he's also a filmmaker, Richard Poplak. I think a lot of you know about him. And then we have the former chair and current Secretary General of the South African National Editors Forum, Mahlatse Mahlase. Welcome. I don't even know where to start, but I'm really excited to have you here, all of you here today, because it's such a balanced view that we're going to have. But maybe let me go to Mahlatse. Mahlatse, you represent all these editors who, from time to time, get into trouble. You know, we had the Sunday Times with SARS, and you guys have to come up each time. We had Daily Maverick, and I'm sure that our good friend Richard will talk to us about it later, just a few weeks ago. What is your role? What is the role of SANEF, and what do you do? Do you have a stick and a carrot, or do you just have little sticks?
I wish we had sticks. So SANEF really is the coming together of two organizations before or during apartheid, really. There was the Black Editors Forum, and there was another organization that represented mostly white editors forum. And at the time, the founders of the organization was to cement the role of media in a democratic South Africa and say that as an industry, we have a contribution to make. And how do we pick up the lessons from fighting apartheid and the role that the media played in exposing the atrocities of apartheid and the inhumanity and the stripping of people of their dignity, and saying that democratic South Africa, what is the role of media and how do we contribute? So as an organization is that history of South Africa where once we were separated and now we've come together. And we see our role as being active in making sure that the industry transforms. That's a very critical role for us. And not only transforms from, media owners, but also who leads the newsrooms, how are people represented in the stories that we cover, and also just charting a way forward for South Africa. And then the other part is ensuring ethical journalism, which is really our mainstay, and ensuring that we protect the trust relationship between the media industry and the South African public. And those are very critical. I mean, there's other things that we look at in terms of diversity, gender transformation being part of it, but representation as well, etc. And also, we play quite a critical role in the education of journalists. So we also do have academics that are part of SANEF, and just in terms of where the curriculum is, how does it adapt to the new world of digital, the new teachings on how to report on children and gender-based violence, etc. So we play quite a critical role in those different spheres. But I think more importantly, we've also become the voice of journalism at a time when people, in their desperate attempts to protect their hands in the cookie jar, have started attacking the media quite ferociously and sometimes, quite disgustingly, I must add. So we've become that critical voice, I think. But the conversation that you're having now is also to position the media, because South African media has played such a critical role in driving change and also just informing South African public around how government spends their money or how the private sector is doing, etc. So, that role is becoming even more important. Some people think that in a democracy, you don't need defenders, but actually that's when you really do need the defenders of our democracy. And Section 16 that guarantees media freedom is what we fight for every day.
Let me just follow up with one more question. A lot has been said about the awesome independent media that we have in South Africa. We all know that we are very outspoken voices like Gareth, and we have obviously Richard and many others out there. But you guys go out there, you find the information that shows that people have done wrong, and you've done it over the years. But then it sits there. So doesn't it frustrate you when the evidence is there, but the NPA is not doing anything about it? Or do you just say, okay, we've done our job, let's move on to something else? How does it work? Gareth, let's start with you and then Richard.
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I'm not a journalist. You know, Richard and Mahlatse come at this from a different angle, and both have in their incredible careers been involved in many exposés, many massive investigations, many long-term projects. Which we're a platform at cliffcentral.com that we built largely off the back of a following that I had on radio and television. And we've allowed other people to come in, including, I think we had a show running with the Daily Maverick for some 3.5, 4 years, which I was very proud of. It was a kind of first of its kind podcast. And subsequent to that, they've gone on and done their own. And there are many other people who've come out of our stable who are investigative journalists and who do this kind of reporting. I, however, am not. I mean, my show is really mostly what it's always been, an entertainment show. But we do cover current affairs. And as a result, it's one of the places where you can get the news that is generated by people like Richard and Mahlatse and many of the other editors and journalists in the country. So I look at it from a different point of view. But obviously, South Africa is rich pickings when it comes to these stories. You know, not a week goes by where we don't have something that we should bristle at, frankly. Yeah. And I think our independent media does a huge amount of good in not only making those stories evident to the public, as they did with the Guptas, very famously. And we wouldn't have known if someone hadn't found out about them landing at the Waterkloof Air Force Base all those years ago. We'd probably be still none the wiser, and we wouldn't be watching Judge Zondo trying to manage the State Capture Commission. And we'd probably have thought that President Zuma wasn't half as bad as he was. It's due to the work of great journalists that we can say that we managed to escape that era, or partially. We've made our way halfway out of it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Richard?
Yeah, look, I'm not an activist. You know, I'm a journalist. So this is kind of like woodworking. You put your lunch in your bag when you leave the house, you take your axe, you go try chop down a tree, and at the end of the day, you go home. I can't do anything about how the NPA goes about doing its job. I can't walk into the offices in Pretoria and start shaking people by the coat and begging them to do their jobs. What we can do is report on the shortfalls that exist within the National Prosecuting Authority. Those shortfalls exist because of what has happened historically to that organization, largely due to the Zuma regime. I mean, what did he do? He gutted out the capacity. My job is to report that. You know, it's not to walk into the NPA's office and start kicking ass.
But don't you ever wish you could do that?
You know, I have a very pragmatic kind of view on my role, and I don't put on a red cape at night and run around the house in underwear.
Right. Okay.
I think it's frustrating that as a media you expose these things, and media is a political player. And corruption is big in South Africa, and corruption is a political crime. It's politically inspired. Corruption fuels the politics. Without corruption, we would have a different kind of governance in South Africa, a different kind of economic trajectory. I mean, it determines everything. And then as media people, what do you say about the lack of action from the amount of information, amount of data that you generate, the amount of media leaks, WikiLeaks that you've generated over the years? What do you say as independent media? I mean, when you meet, what kind of attitude do you, what do you think South Africa should be going?
Look, I'd push back a little bit on saying that media are political players. I think we function within a political context, but I think the idea is that we should be relatively agendaless. Now, you know, we can sit here and have arguments about objectivity and subjectivity and where I come from and what my view is. Am I liberal? Am I progressive? All of that stuff, leaving that aside, The actual work of digging through the hard boards when it comes to looking at the mechanisms of corruption that, you're right, effectively define political life in South Africa. Doing that work should be, to a degree, agendaless. How it then enters into the political mainstream, how it then enters into the social and the social discourse in South Africa is quite frankly not my job. And so that very much is the way that I look at it. I know there are lots of journalists who don't see it that way at all, and who see us as having a political role to play and see us having a responsibility to influence the politics of the day. I think that's a dangerous way to look at things. Like, if Jacob Zuma is doing his job, what do I care if it's Jacob Zuma or Cyril Ramaphosa? So long as my kids are going to school and I'm eating, what do I care? So when I say agendaless, the players themselves don't matter to me, right? What matters to me is that we are doing our jobs as an entity and as a bastion of one of the pillars of democracy at any rate, and making sure that the bad guys don't get away with nonsense.
But they seem to be getting away with nonsense.
Absolutely, but that that's where other people have to sit. I can't make the meal, chew the food, digest the food, and go to the toilet.
You can't be jury and judge.
Yeah. There needs to be someone else.
Richard Poplak, who I have a lot of admiration for, and Mahlatse were both, who I also admire hugely. The two of you would, she was nodding along while you were saying that. And Richard, the problem is in so many places, in so many ways now, that kind of thinking is considered almost antiquated by some activist journalists. And, you see them on social media. And I don't think they're real journalists, and maybe you guys don't either, but they do have enormous sway, and they are political players. Many of them are paid for by political organizations. And right. Even though the kind of journalism that you're talking about is the kind that I think we all believe is the credible stuff we want. It's the stuff that gives us all the stuff that came before fake news. It's the reliable information. It's the stuff we can make decisions on, whether we're in business, personally, or anywhere else. But these activist journalists have sort of poisoned the well in some places.
Yeah. Mahlatse?
I've been trying to think at which point do I enter, right? Just from a very important conversation and, activism, media, and just being pure information providers. I think there's a middle ground somewhere there. The reality of it is that as the media, we are a powerful force. And I don't think any of us ever undermine the power of the pen to influence public discourse. And it's what the Constitution, I guess, also gives us. I mean, when we talk about the media being the lifeblood of a democracy, is that it plays a critical role in informing its citizenry so that it can make informed choices. So that is where the media comes in. I think our role is to reflect South Africa to South Africans, right? And then what happens, then it's up to South Africans, whether it's the political actors, it's the South African public in the decision they make when they get to the poll, or in the conversations that get to dominate the radio stations when we listen in to people's views. But that is the role of the media. I think our role is to inform South Africans, and what the different South Africans do with that information is up to them. And maybe to bring it in also to what Gareth was speaking about earlier around when you look at the State Capture Commission. The reality of it is that every day when you listen in, most of that information South African media has reported on in different ways, right? That is the reality. And for us to get to a point of the State Capture Commission is because of the work the media was doing, and then you had civil actors who were pushing for accountability. That might not be our role as journalists, but those that occupy different roles, civic society, then comes in and puts the pressure if they think there should be pressure. Or those within political parties put the pressure because they think there should be pressure. Ours is to put the information out there. But I think sometimes, some journalists, have kind of muddied the line between their role and also being activists or even being players in the political development of this country. And it's our role to say, actually reflect and say, where do we put that line and where do we actually ensure that journalists still remember that their role is to actually be information providers, and there's power in being somebody who provides information and doesn't participate in the political activities, because then that grows the distinction and the audience receiving it doesn't get your information and see it as tainted.
Right. But look, guys, we live also today in 2021 in a South Africa of fake news and alternative truths. I mean, you can stand out there and say, Ace Mahashula is innocent and he's the victim of the legal system. And there are enough people out there to believe that and to rally around him. When all of that happens, the scrutiny on the media is really, really tight, or maybe the two things are parallel to each other. Because when a journalist, and especially a respected journalist like Jack Powell, makes a mistake, as he did recently, it's important that you deal with it in a way that doesn't give reason to all those rogue forces out there to say, this is who they are. How do you then respectfully speak about a journalist you respected for so many years after he's done what he's done? And also mindful that you need to be protective of the image of the media. Because in South Africa and maybe in the broader world, people don't say the journalists, they say the media. When one of you makes a mistake, they're going to say, you see, this is what the media does. This is the agenda. How do you come out of that?
That's a great question. And we're speaking about the Constitution a lot today. The Constitution of South Africa, which enshrined certain rights for the media, was written in a different universe. I mean, the iPhone didn't exist when the Constitution was written. There was no internet, or it certainly wasn't as widely used. It's a different universe. The playing field, the battlefield, rather, was completely different in that time. So the contexts that you're speaking of, Solly, are completely different. And these wars that we're fighting, right, could never have been anticipated 25, 26 years ago. And so the real question we now face is, can we ever be wrong again? Because every time we're wrong, no matter how big the mistake or how small, it is another cudgel handed, another weapon handed to the Ace Magashulas of the world, to the RET faction within the ANC, whose job it is to undermine an independent media and to generate skepticism towards the kind of work that we do, right? So, these are very, very real problems that are faced by media institutions all over the world. The bad guys now know where to hit us, and they hit us where we're weakest. They hit us on issues of transformation, be it gender or racial. They hit us on issues of whose voices are centered within the context of the conversations that we generate, right? They hit us mostly every time we make a screw up. Our backs are up against the wall, right? And we are effectively, all over the world, for there to be an independent media, to a degree we have to be self-regulated, right? And that's what SUN effectively is. It's an oversight body that helps us regulate ourselves in a coherent way. These are very, very dangerous positions to be in. And while it's right to say that our institutions are powerful, they have also never been more precarious. Media in South Africa has never been in a more precarious position. Never. Never economically, and certainly never as an institution, sort of in conversation with democratic institutions.
We're facing an existential crisis as an industry.
Yes, absolutely.
We have financial models that are definitely not working. Newsrooms are becoming smaller and smaller. And that's a crisis we need to not only as journalists confront, but I think as South Africans, because if we look at where our country is, I think we don't need to overemphasize the importance of independent media, and especially media that is protected from political and especially economic influence. So I think that's the one thing. But I think going back to a Jack issue, for example, I think What is important is how, when those mistakes happen, how we react as an industry. Because the way we've designed ourselves is that we are not never going to make mistakes. That is why the Press Council exists. And that's part and a key important thing around accountability, that we do have a place where we can be held accountable as an industry. We are not a law unto ourselves. That's quite critical. Two is that when we are wrong, we own up to those mistakes and we take corrective measures. That's how we rebuild the trust relationship. Yes, you'll always have people that are looking at your weaknesses and are ready to take that baton and hit you over the head with it until you disappear into a hole. But the reality of it is that the industry has taken action, whether it's the action taken by the individual media organization that saw the editorial lapse, or it's an industry body like SANEF. But also, if we had actually wronged somebody, there is the Press Council where if those two things are not reacted, it will actually hold people accountable. And often, people will say, it's this small apology, whatever. But the reality is, look at what has happened in the past decade. Do you remember when the Sunday Times had to apologize on lampposts to Ronnie Castro's? That is major,
The rogue unit,
Yeah, I don't think we should look at the industry and say it will never make mistakes. What we should be looking at is, how do we react when we've actually made a mistake? The fact that as an industry body, we have said something went horribly wrong during the state capture era. Right. How do we as an industry hold ourselves accountable and account for our role in that project? I think what we are doing as an industry is quite unique. Very few people have done it. I think maybe the accountants have tried to do it here and there with some people, but we've said a industry-wide inquiry that allows members of the public to contribute to it, and we've made it public. And that is us holding ourselves accountable and saying, we see our role, it's quite important. Where we have erred, show us those mistakes, but the important thing is we are actually also going to move forward. And we should never, as an industry, divorce ourselves from being held accountable and to actually not respond to sometimes criticism that is constructive.
Right. Can I just ask a question to Gareth? Gareth, you are a very outspoken person, and there are people out there who'd love to hate you. Maybe this question should go to you and to Richard. As we live in a country, and Richard made reference earlier to the issue of race. Do you have to have a thicker skin when you're a white male or white person in the media in South Africa if you have to go after Magashule? Or have you guys gone to a stage where you say, you know what, the truth is truth, tough, let them deal with it, boom? Do you have to be always mindful that, I'm a white dude, I have to be careful how I say this thing?
I think there might even be more pressure on black journalists because there are a lot of threats that are leveled at journalists, even junior ones, in newsrooms around the country, and for various reasons. That I don't think it's worth equating whether or not white people or black people have a tougher time. I think what we've got to be very clear on is the fact that if you are a journalist and you're doing some seriously interesting work and you're uncovering some proper corruption, you're likely to be in the firing line. They don't care whether you're black or white. It's in fact the only time that you can be sure. It's the only time you can be absolutely sure the politicians aren't being racist. Is that if you're an enemy, they'll definitely try to get you out of their way. But I also think there's a responsibility on the public here. I admire the fact that both Richard and Mahlatse here are saying that the institutions of journalism, the newsrooms, need to be responsible and accountable. But there seems to me also to be a very high standard set for them and a not so high standard set for people who are putting out fake news or who are just ordinary citizens who are spreading rubbish around, and also for the politicians themselves who seem to have no responsibility except to their own, I wouldn't even say constituencies, because we have a party list system in the country. So if we're going to, and I think it's a good thing that we hold journalists to a very high account. I think that's why so many who have good reputations, who've done the brave work, have earned their reputation. But I also think that's why it might be in our favor occasionally to, and there's no particular incident that I can refer to here, but when people go after someone, and sometimes these outrages are manufactured online, and it could even be a journalist that people are that they're manufacturing an outrage against. Sometimes those are those are very strategic and paid for campaigns which seek to delegitimize a particular publication or a particular person in that publication. And Richard knows this has happened to Maverick journalists, where someone in either the ruling party or one of the opposition parties has an axe to grind, and they become very personal. They will, we know what Bell Pottinger was doing on behalf of Zuma and the Guptas, and that was a coordinated campaign against free-speaking South Africans, some of them journalists, some of them not, in order to distract, in order to silence, in order to defer people to a story that was becoming embarrassing for those who were creaming money off on the side. So I think we've got to be aware, and as a listener and as a viewer and as a reader, I take it very seriously that I monitor a wide range of publications, and that I follow people, both whom I know in a certain category are the credible ones who don't spread fake news, and in other categories I allow the fake news people in just so that I can keep an eye on what they're doing. Because on the right and on the left in South Africa, we've got huge disinformation campaigns going on. People who get a thrill out of spreading absolute nonsense around.
Absolutely. Solly, I think you brought up an interesting point. Me and Gareth have big muscles. I think we'll be fine. We lost a colleague last week, Karima Brown. She was doxxed, and as far as I read those tweets, threatened with sexual assault or rape by people associated with the EFF. That is a fact. Another fact, other female colleagues of ours, Paulie van Wyk, her work with VBS and the EFF, and many other female journalists constantly have to deal with the veiled or explicit threat of sexual assault in this country. And given our our insane levels of gender-based violence, I think those threats need to be taken very, very seriously. Second, there was an editorial in the Daily Maverick today that stated that journalists are investigating the machinations within the SAPS are starting to get pinged on their cell phones, and their movements are starting to be triangulated. Again, that's another fact. So, the threats against journalists, doing specific stories, and certainly journalists who make the grave mistake of being female while working, these threats are only burgeoning, and they're getting worse. There's a part of me that wants to be very bleak about what's coming down the line in the next several years. But for South Africans, we're always 1 minute before midnight. I don't want to be too bleak about it, but I think the threats to certain certain segments of our industry are very, very real, and based on the stories that you're doing, they can be quite dangerous, and they're getting more so.
Mahlatse, what do you deal with the dichotomy between embedded journalists and independent media as SANEF?
Before I answer that, I just want to emphasize the use of social media as a weapon, especially against women journalists. It is actually quite disgusting, and it has such lasting effects. I mean, can you imagine, as a junior journalist, seeing senior reporters being attacked, sexualized the way they are, what you are likely to do? You are just simply not going to touch a critical story around those political actors, especially. And the attacks really, they inform how I engage with the platform, because sometimes my friends would call and say, "Are you okay?" And I'd be like, "What has happened?" Because I've had to take the decision to engage very differently with Twitter. And I can only imagine the effect on other junior journalists. And it's becoming harder and harder to convince them that, these are people that are simply trying to silence you, because that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to silence the media by those attacks. And it's something that we need to attend to as a country quite urgently, I think. Embedded journalists. What is an embedded journalist? It's a term that we've used when, especially during the war in Iraq, where American journalists were with the American government. I don't know in the South African context, how are we defining embedded journalists? in my view, right, it's better to have a journalist that is playing open cards and saying, this are my politics. We are not yet there yet as South Africans. Where, for example, in the British media, you know that there's conservatives and liberals, right? And you know the platforms where they're likely to lead to. I think hopefully with the deepening of our democracy, we will be clearer as media houses, right? And once we are playing open cards, the public reads what we are reading with that cover, right? Of understanding that this publication is leaning to this particular political party, or this reporter, their background and their history is 1, 2, and 3. Because at the end of the day, what you need the most is a discerning public, right? Especially in the face of fake news, right? You want a public that asks questions when they read an article, whether it's an article written by a reputable media house that is trusted, etc. The public still needs to be discerning and ask the right question and not just consume and accept, right? They need to be asking questions with every article that they're reading. And for me, that's where democracy thrives. That is when democracy is actually strengthened. And we can say that we have an informed and a citizenry that actually participate in our democracy. I really believe that the media does have the responsibility to play open cards with the public and let the public then read the information with that rider if that's necessary.
I think the term embedded journalist in the South African context, Gauta, effectively means a journalist who is working for a specific agenda, perhaps even with a program from a political party.
Maybe some of Iqbal Surf's people. I don't know.
Well, I think that is just one big embedded journalist party. But there's an example of an independent media company that isn't independent at all. It has a very specific agenda. It's taken its money for a very specific reason, and it is not an honest player in the media space by any means. That's a really, really sophisticated, really, really expensive spoiler campaign. That's almost like a grenade thrown into a room that one of us is going to have to jump on at some point to save everybody else. It's super, super dangerous. And this stuff happens all over the world, and it happens all the time. But I think Mahlatse is exactly right about media literacy. It's wonderful that your children can read and write. But if they don't know who owns Facebook, if they don't know how Twitter functions, then are they really literate? I mean, there's a whole new component to how we have to act as literate and mediated citizens in the 21st century. That's A, super, super complicated, and B, requires constant engagement and constant moderation in terms of how we do this. So, there are many new laws and there are many new games. And, sadly, we all have to kind of keep on top of them.
I would just throw in that we take Twitter way too seriously, and we give Twitter an enormous amount of power that we shouldn't. Twitter it's really just the most messy and low quality net that catches all the rubbish that floats to the top. And I'm afraid in South Africa, we've also got to take cognizance of the fact that there are maybe 4 million people on Twitter, 4 million active users, and that's not a lot. And also, these people are not the intelligentsia. These people are not the policy makers. And these people are very often just grumpy, angry losers who are stuck in situations where they don't really have any other way to express themselves. And they've, if you drove past a meth addict on the street and they started shouting something at you don't engage with the meth addict and ask them for their political point of view or try to fight them on the facts or say to them, you're fake news. You would get out of the way and move as far away from that meth addict as you can. And I think Twitter has to be treated like a meth addict on the street. Unless you are a doctor, get the hell away from them.
But like Gareth, I mean, Twitter is just a platform. On Twitter, you're going to find a whole diversity of people. It's a very cacophonous platform. There's no doubt about it. But you can't blame the platform.
Well, I think it's
No?
also, it's gone from being a place where you just had a lot of people disagreeing or arguing or putting points forward or being funny. It's gone to a place which the politicians observe far more acutely than we would like to admit, where journalists, the weaker and less prominent and less successful journalists in the country, get all of their news. And it's the lazy place. It's where, it's where people go for a really thinly veiled form of propaganda rather than news. And depending on what they like propaganda-wise, they either find right-wing conspiracy theories or they find, left-wing ideology. And if that's all they want, I think it's actually doing more harm than good.
I have a question to you guys on independence. What do we mean by independent media? Independent from what? And are there degrees of independence? In other words, Daily Maverick is an awesome publication. I just love it to bits, okay? It's the in thing now, it's like, it's a cool thing. But how independent are you? Is there like a degree? Is it like 95% independence, 80%, 90%, 100%? Independent from what? What does it really mean? And how do you sustain that?
I'm going to take us back a little to what Gareth was talking about. And the reality of it, I think the media also has to take some responsibility in terms of the weight it has given to Twitter as a platform. I think in part it reflects a certain conversation happening within a certain sector of the South African public, right? And by and large, it does not represent South Africans at all. But sometimes that's where, when we look at the media, we tend to look at mainstream media and not necessarily the rest of the smaller community media houses. And also, the one example I like to give is that, somebody said Josie FM. People call Josie FM first when a car is stolen and then call the cops later. And that's how important those community stations are increasingly.
Interesting.
The SABC and its vernacular stations, they continue to have huge audiences. That's a very important question about what is independent media. I think independent media for me represents a media that is not influenced by the politics of the day, that is able to be protected from commercial interest, and a media whose survival does also not dependent on individuals and commercial interests, right? But I think in South Africa, when we also talk about an independent media, it's because of the co-regulation system that we have going currently. Because that means that if you write anything around the public, you have somewhere to go and an independent body that actually can come in and intervene. And that is why when independent media, the group, left the press council, we are quite worried about that and remain quite worried about it because that's the largest media house in South Africa with publications across South Africa. And the question is, can they be independent if they are regulating themselves without an independent body? I think the press council guarantees the independence of media because you have somewhere where you can go to complain.
Investigative journalism is operating in a very hostile world in South Africa. Sure. The whistleblower legislation institutions are very weak. They don't comply with the United Nations Convention on the Combating and Prevention of Corrupt Activities. There are very few. In fact, there are no institutions. Crime-fighting institutions are very weak. The Hawks is very weak. Yeah. Now, whistleblowers and investigative journalism operate in that very hostile world. We talked about Polly van Wyk, and this week a witness in the Transnet appearing before the Zondo Commission was shot at here in Sandton. Now, how much pressure is there on that on investigative journalists in this context of poor protection? I mean, as I said, corruption is a political crime. Yes. Politicians don't have incentive to come up with these needed institutions that will protect whistleblowers and investigative journalists. Now, how much danger is there? How much pressure is there?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want to get a sense of where the priorities are, the ANC's National Executive Committee sat down and did a 5.5-hour Zoom call with President Zuma, where apparently he spoke for 2 hours. Can you imagine listening to Jacob Zuma speak for 2 hours straight, where he complained about his treatment at the Zondo Commission, etc. Meanwhile, very little to nothing is said by the governing party about the rights of whistleblowers and the importance of investigative media. So I think right there we can tell that there is a lot of investment in protecting the ANC's own and protecting the authority and coherence of the ANC, and very little interest or care is taken on the protection of those who are on the other side of that. So I would argue that we're pretty nervous. And I would argue that, once again, we come back to this precariousness, which I think is a very, very real aspect of operating in the journalist space right now in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. I mean, we're part of global phenomena. Yes. You know, we're in the middle of a digital and cultural revolution. And the bad guys are serious about maintaining their own interests. So, once again, I think the situation is precarious, and we continue to worry, and we continue to take those threats very, very, very seriously.
So the Daily Maverick has come a long way. You guys, I saw you a little the documentary for you were speaking. I think it was an address that you gave, Richard, talking about the Marikana story, how that was the story that made you. It was very brave. Nothing has happened, but we've discussed that. Do you feel, given the changes happening in South African politics now, I mean, so far we're lucky that we can still say the things that we like to say. We haven't got stories of journalists being arrested in South Africa, but there are tensions happening in the ANC, and the group that's wanting to take over, it doesn't give me the impression that they would be very kind to independent media. Are you guys keeping an eye on those people? Do you feel that the freedoms that you have today might disappear if those guys were to take over?
Had the Zuma faction won in Nasrec in 2017, I think we would not be having this conversation right now, and that's to put it kindly. I mean, other people on this panel may disagree with me, but I do not think that the Zuma, RET, now Ace Magashula, Didi Mabuza faction, whatever you want to call them, EFF, I don't think they have the media's best intentions at heart. I don't know where I get that sense from. It's just a feeling I have. But they are not interested in a free and quote-unquote independent media, however we choose to define that. And I think should they end up being victorious, and it is very much a fight. It is very much a fight, and the ball is still very much in play. Should they be victorious, I don't think we'll be enjoying evenings like this one under that sort of regime.
I don't think state capture is. We can celebrate yet that state capture is behind us.
No.
It's very much entrenched.
Absolutely.
As we saw with the attack on the Capitol Hill, democracy is not in very good hands.
When 94 happened, South Africans sat down and said, oh, we've got democracy now. Well, we'll vote every 5 years and get on with business. And that's not how it works. I think what we're learning around the world, I mean, if we need any greater indication of how democracy is a constant process of vigilance that needs to be engaged with every single day, then January 6th in the United States of America of this year was a case in point. The greatest democracy in the world, and one of the oldest, was literally raided by men wearing bear costumes. And so I think we're not out of the woods yet by any means. And it's a constant process.
Freedom needs defenders, guys. Freedom needs defenders. And sometimes I worry that in this country, we leave those defenders are supposed to be the journalists who are supposed to defend themselves. And that's why I cry out every day to say we need to see more people fighting for media freedom so that we don't end up in a position where somebody thinks
maybe Mahlatse, we're putting our faith in the wrong thing. I mean, perhaps democracy isn't the perfect vehicle that so many people have sold it to us as. And maybe we've got to be realistic about what Churchill said is the worst of a bunch of terrible systems. Or sorry, the best of a bunch of terrible systems. I put more faith in modernity. I put more faith in technology. I put more faith in the free market than I do in democracy, because those things have inevitably brought, wherever they have been in the ascendant, they've brought people freedom and they've brought people individual liberty. And I think that to address the question from Solly earlier about independent media, the idea of having an independent media environment is dependent, ironically, on how many of those organizations are able to operate successfully and grow their audiences and be commercially successful, apart from, and remember, that's a direct relationship. And this is why with cliffcentral.com, I'm so grateful for the audience that we have. Although we don't do, and we decided at the beginning not to charge our listeners or to force them to subscribe or anything else. It is a very successful system. And I know it worked very well for the Maverick in certain ways, because there is a kind of freemium model which works all over the world. And that relationship that they have directly with their audience is a very powerful one. And it's incorruptible, because it doesn't matter who gets in the way. The audience trust the institution or the journalists. They get their news directly from it, and they pay for that. And therefore, they can get a higher quality of work from them as well. If you can manufacture good information, you can entertain, influence, inspire, and empower people in a positive way, then people will be prepared to pay for that. And the more organizations, little ones that will start off with, 1,000 subscribers or listeners or viewers here or there, and grow those audiences, we should encourage. We shouldn't consider them a threat to the mainstream media. Unfortunately, the mainstream media has not helped, because they've been at various stages of the development of our economy and the media environment. They've been enemies to small media organizations. They've actually gone out of their way to ridicule. And I mean, I've got a list of people who, when we started 7 years ago, said, this is going to be a disaster. These guys will never make it. Gareth's a moron. It's the commercial models. Why would they pay for this if they've never paid for radio? And quite the opposite has happened. I'm not one of the survivors, and many of those people are no longer employed. So I think we've got to look at bringing more people into the fray. People who do sometimes have pretty bizarre opinions, people who do sometimes represent less credible news outlets, and let the public decide. More speech is the answer, not less. Let's not let government regulate too much of what we're doing, which is why it's so important that SANEF exists, or the Broadcasting Complaints Commission, or ICASA, when it used to be an independent place. I think that we've got to have a lot more of that. And the internet, fortunately, is a genie that you can't put back in the bottle. A government will have a very tough time pushing all of the energy that's come out of the internet back into any kind of regulated environment. In fact, I don't think they can do it. One of the best things about living in South Africa is that all the bad ideas that our government have are not going to be implemented because they're incompetent.
So, Mahlatse, what do you think? Are you watching the RET brigade? Oh, sorry, those people, who have coalesced around former President Jacob Zuma. Are you watching them? Are you worried? Do you, as Richard said earlier, do you think if they were to take over, you guys, all of us with big mouths and big opinions, would end up having to look for other homes outside of South Africa?
So I think for me, it's not only just the RET. I've been monitoring, for example, the new DA leader, John Steenhuisen, and we've been counting how many times he has actually criticized the media and blamed the media for his problems, right? I mean, just the recent example of the Sunday Times lead around with him saying that he would work with Cyril Ramaphosa and not with Didi Mapusa, and the attack on the Sunday Times. They eventually released the audio tape and allowed for the media for the public to be able to hear him and make up its mind. But also during when he came to power during his election, I think there were at least three bullets that he fired at the media, and I'm counting, right? And then there's also the EFF. And that they have decided that the media is the enemy, and what they will do is discredit the media, and they've allowed their supporters to continuously attack journalists in the worst ways, right? And the sexualization of reporters is what we talked about. So I think there is a climate in South Africa that is against a free and independent and critical media. And we must be careful that when those forces do come together, the ultimate result of it is also to weaken the public's trust in the media, because the media continues to do what it's doing. But if you've got this amalgamation of people that are attacking the media, you are now weakening the public trust. And once that is lost, right, you won't actually have an audience to speak of, Gareth. And that is a real threat to South African media. And that is why I think we shouldn't wait to whenever the RET take over from the ANC, or if one day the EFF or even the DA stand up takes over. But we should be acting now, because it's those small actions, small in inverted commas, that are chipping away at the trust relationship. And that trust deficit is going to be our worst enemy.
Yeah, I really just want you guys, if you have 2 minutes, to just say a few words about where you see South Africa going in terms of, Mahlatse, you've mentioned a few times, quite a few times really, that you would like to see a South African public that's a bit more defensive of media. But sometimes I wonder if the media is the microcosm of the ANC, or if the ANC is if South Africa is a microcosm of the ANC, or if the ANC is a microcosm of South Africa. Because no matter what you say, there are people who just will not believe you. I really don't see South Africa where everybody is going to say, let's defend media. They defend media provided it says what they want to hear, no?
But we have seen the public come to our defense. So we have seen corporate South Africa coming in to support journalists now recently, when a lot of them were losing their jobs. I think the other thing that corporate South Africa can do is decisively support South African media houses in terms of their advertising rands. That's a real support that we can give, because our survival is quite critical. We can't be having this conversation if less and less people are employed in newsrooms and less Cliff Central types are created, etc. So I think corporate South Africa can play that critical role of decisively taking money away from Facebook and Google and saying we are going to support South African media. And that's what they can do to support us.
Yeah, look, as I've said, we are in the midst of a cultural and a political and effectively an industrial or a digital revolution, and we have to constantly moderate how we do things in order to survive. This huge ecosystem of voices that Gareth mentioned earlier, that the idea of that delights me, and I love the mess of democracy. What I don't like is the fact that that facts have been so minimized in all of this. Opinion is one thing. There's the old joke, opinion are like assholes. Everybody has one. But what we need to do as credible media houses is root ourselves in fact-based investigation and fact-based discourse. That has to be the root that we go back to, facts.
Okay, well, folks, that's it today. It's been an awesome discussion. It never ends, right? I think we're going to have to do it again maybe in a few months' time. Let's see what happens in this very fast evolving socio-economic political situation in South Africa. But it's been great. Thank you very much. And to our listeners out there, please continue to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Soli and Gauta.
Thanks for watching Soli and Gauta Uncut. Please subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button. And for notifications of new episodes, please click the bell. Till next time.